afternoon to everyone. You know, with poor Nelson, I felt sorry for him when he couldn't get that thing to stop playing. It reminded me of an experience we had back in St. Petersburg at the Feast of Tabernacles. It must have been back in, probably 80, 81, somewhere around there. And there were about 9,000 people coming in for the feast. And we had a pre-feast meeting of all the department heads. And so we're sitting there. Bob Jones was he was the pastor and he was the festival elder. And he went around to each department head and he said, well, how's everything? You got all the security taken care of, you have the offering taken care of. And he came to Ron Peterson and he said, Mr. Peterson, how are we doing with the electronics? Everything up and running with the electronics? And he said, oh, sure, everything's perfect as long as it works. and poor Mr. Jones, his face kind of melted. He was so surprised to have that kind of a response. So whenever I see a malfunction or a lack of cooperation from electronics, I think of that story. Because so many of the good experiences that we've had in life, at least in our lives, has come from our family and our church and our experiences within the Church of God. You know, when I was a teenager, back in early 50s, Thanksgiving was a very important day to us because right after it got dark on Thanksgiving, the men in the family would get in the car and go deer hunting. And I don't think the ladies appreciated it that much, but we just couldn't wait to get up and to go deer hunting. Because in the mountains of Pennsylvania, it's a beautiful, beautiful state. If any of you have never been there, it's worth a trip if you have the opportunity, just to see the beauty of the mountains and the trees and the streams. But of course, by the time we got into the mountains, it was dark. And the roads, the state roads and the federal roads did not have lighting at that time. Street lighting was rare. You had to get near the cities. You had to get near the towns in order to have street lights. And I can remember driving through these beautiful, dark, brooding mountains at night. And as we would come up towards the top of a hill, it would start to get light. We would see light, illumination, coming from towns. And there weren't that many towns along that road, maybe 5 in the 150 miles that we traveled. And as you come over the top of the mountain, and there was this lovely city, lovely town, lovely community, very peaceful, very quiet. And it was, as a young teenager, it was inspiring to me just to see how nice it was to experience coming to the light there. Now, if you think about it, most towns, most cities are built in the valleys because it protects you from the wind, from the snow, generally the rain coming down, you have streams nearby. It's very comfortable living in the valleys. But have you ever seen a city on top of a hill? There aren't that many in the world. Jerusalem was up on a hill at one time. Denver is the mile-high city, but when you get up to that mile, it's a plateau. It's not really like a mountaintop. But you know, you can see it for miles and miles as you come near it. And you get up to that mountaintop or up to that plateau, and you're surrounded by really big, tall mountains. So they are protected from the strange weather that can occur to a city on a hill. Now, Matthew 5:14 talks about the Church of God. This was Jesus after he had his intellectual and spiritual battle with Satan. He came down from the mountain, and he went to what was known as the Sermon on the Mount. And he was teaching the people about the kingdom of God, and the kingdom was coming. And he talked to his disciples, and he talked to his apostles. And he said in Matthew 5, verse 14, he said, "You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden." Think about that. How could you hide a city on a hill? It'd be difficult to do. Now, in the days when Jesus said this, they didn't have street lights. They didn't have electric lights. They had candles. They had oil lamps. And he continues, verse 15. He says, "Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel." That'd be silly, wouldn't it? Light a candle, put it under a bushel. He said, "But on a candlestick. And it gives light into everybody in the house." And I suppose if you were in a very dark room, a very dark home, with no electricity, no electric lights, one candle could illuminate a large area. But you know, the idea of having a candle under a bushel, I think, has spiritual undertones and spiritual meanings for us. Because you know, one of the things that we look at the book of Revelations, and we learn a story about candlesticks. Let's look at Revelation 1, verse 20. This is the chapter that tells about the revelation that God the Father gave to Jesus. Jesus gave it to his messenger, his angel, and that angel gave it to the Apostle John. And in verse 20, well, actually, we can start back before verse 20, where he talks about 7 candlesticks. He says in verse 10, he says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a great voice as a trumpet, saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last." And then he goes on to tell John that there are certain things that he had to do. He says, "I send you unto the churches which are in Asia, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea." He says, "And I turned," in verse 12, "to see the voice that spoke to me. And being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks." That must have been a very beautiful sight. 7 candlesticks made of gold. And when we see the analogies later on, I think we can appreciate more deeply what he's talking about here. He says, in the middle of the 7 candlesticks, one like the Son of Man. And then he goes on and it talks about, it gives a description of Jesus. And he says, "Write these things which you have seen," in verse 19, "and the things which are, and the things which are shall be hereafter. The mystery of the 7 stars which you saw," and there were, you see, on top of each one of these golden candlesticks was a star shining. And it was a representation, obviously. It was not a real star, but it looked like a star, and it was probably twinkling very beautifully. He says, the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the church. So each one of these 7 churches that were going to be talked about had their own angel as their own messenger. He says they're the angels of the 7 churches. And the 7 churches, or the 7 candlesticks which you saw, are the 7 churches. Think about that. 7 churches with an incredible job to do. These were probably the very first 7 churches in Asia, as far as we know. And John was given a message for these churches. Now let's back up, well, let's go forward a couple thousand years. From 90 AD, here we are in 2013, going on 2014 pretty soon. And we don't have just 7 churches. And some have taken these verses to refer just to, although it speaks to just 7, represents all of the churches of God. And I don't have a problem with that. But you see, when we look at the churches and compare them to candlesticks, when we see that these candlesticks represent the church of God, I have to ask the question, are there churches of God that are putting their light under a bushel? You don't have to answer that. It's a rhetorical question. Are there churches that have their light under a bushel? Some churches, you can't go and you can't drive into the town and pick up the phone and say, "Hi, I'm going to be in town for a couple of days. Can I come by, attend church with you?" Well, who are you? Have you been approved? Are you part of are you on our computer list? I see some people who may have even experienced this at one time. That's not the way Jesus wants his church to behave. But I've got to ask the question, has the church of God been a real city on the hill? Has it let its light shine to the whole world? What about the Church of God in Miami? Church of God in Auburndale, where we attend. Are we being like a city set on a hill? And today I'd like to discuss this subject of a city on the hill because, we are supposed to be the light to the world. And when we see the way some of our, and this is not a criticism of anybody or any particular church, but there are not very many churches that in the Church of God families that would allow us to hire a van and come up to Auburndale and just meet with a group of people that you don't usually meet with, or go to over to Clearwater, Largo, Pinellas Park to have a feast together with 4 or 5 different churches. Churches that don't normally meet together on a regular basis, may not even know what each other church believes in a minor sense. In the overall sense, yes, we know what our churches all believe. But the fact that we can be together as brothers and sisters in Christ, I think is important to Jesus of Nazareth. He didn't die just for Worldwide Church of God. He didn't die just for Church of God International or just for the Church of God in Miami. He gave his life blood for every man, woman, child on the face of the earth, regardless of their race, their color, their language. Jesus Christ gave his life for them, for us. And as we heard in the hymn, he knows our name. He knows who we are. He knows what we do. He knows how we serve him. Now, are we serving him the way he wants us to? Now, without regarding the integrity or the conversion of the shepherds of the Church of God, God has allowed certain things to happen within the church that if you and I were running things, we would never put up with some of the things that Jesus endures. But there are some who lead the flocks who lead them astray. The flock has been scattered in so many small flocks that it's difficult to look around the world and find God's church, just small pockets, like gold in the mountain waiting to be discovered. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the fruit of the scattered flocks? Well, in order to understand that, we have to understand the different kinds of shepherds that there are. See, the Bible talks about three kinds of shepherds. They're good shepherds, represented by Jesus Christ, and those who serve him faithfully. There are worthless shepherds, and you can, if you're interested, do a study on that word shepherds, and see if all three of these are not part of God's description of the shepherds of Israel's flock. Worthless shepherds. They have no works. They don't accomplish anything. They have a good time, maybe. And then there are hirelings. There are people that will say, and I have heard ministers say this, I can teach anything that church wants me to teach as long as they pay me. And you and I, brethren, are in a position where we need to be exercising our discernment. Because Christ warned his disciples, look, they're going to be worthless servants. They're going to be worthless shepherds. Let's look at Matthew 5:17 for a minute. Matthew 5:7. I'm sorry, I misspoke that. Matthew 5, verse 7. We just left there and now we're back to it. I'm sorry, Matthew 7. My eyes are playing tricks on me this morning, excuse me. Matthew 7, verse 15. Jesus is again speaking to his disciples and telling them the things that they needed to know to be prepared for what was coming. In Matthew 7, verse 15, he says, beware of false prophets. Now, you might say, well, why would he warn them about false prophets? Has anybody in here seen false prophets in the past 5 years? Maybe not in here, but they've been in the world. They said, Christ is coming next month. Let's all go off to Belize or someplace else. Let's be ready for his coming. Beware of false prophets. There are false prophets who will mislead us if we allow them to. They come to you in sheep's clothing, he said, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. The question then becomes, how can you tell a true prophet from a false prophet? And we can go back into the Old Testament and read some of the examples. God said, if what they say comes to pass, then all right, that's one thing. But if it doesn't come to pass, then it's a false prophet. You reject them. And we need to be aware because there will be false prophets, false ministers, false servants who will try to come in amongst us and mislead the flock. He says in verse 16, you shall know them by their fruits. That makes sense. Think about this. He says, do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? I've never picked figs, but I've picked citrus, and I've picked apples, and I've picked grapes off my own grapevine. You don't get grapes of thorns. Where there's thorns, you don't have a good grape. You don't have a good grape. Now, maybe for some things it might be okay, but not a good grape for wine. Not a good grape for jelly or jam. He says, know them by their fruits. He says in verse 17, even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit. But a corrupt tree, what about a corrupt tree? A corrupt tree brings forth evil fruits. And usually, you can tell, if you've got, and this is not always the case, but if you've got thorns on a tree, very often it's a sour piece of fruit that you gather from it. Not always, but most of the times that's the way it is. And I guess that's why it's so difficult to tell, because you never know 100% sure just because you find thorns, is it a bad tree? What fruit do we see from among the churches of God? You know, Jesus was always willing to challenge the false teachings as well as the bad examples of the religious leaders. I'm not going to turn there, but Matthew 23, the 8 woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And he goes down a litany of item after item after item where they're teaching God's people error, where they're teaching God's people things that they shouldn't be hearing, things that didn't matter. He said, you know, full well you reject the commandments of God that you can keep your own traditions. And we don't have traditions, basically, in the Church of God. Some small little things here and there. But basically, we don't have the kind of traditions that Jesus was dealing with. You know, we need to always be willing to challenge false teachings as well as the bad examples of the religious leaders. Some churches aren't willing to do that. One major church has got pedophiles, has every kind of perversion with young children, and yet they hide these people. They won't publish their names. They keep them away. They keep the press away from them because I don't think they want the full amount of perversion to be broadcast. But you see, we have to challenge, brethren, because if we are going to serve Jesus Christ of Nazareth, we have to be willing to stand up for the things that are true and be willing to die for the things that are true and to refuse the things that are false. Jesus challenged their traditions and their teachings. Their spiritual leadership was worthless and vain. We're blessed collectively in most of the churches of God today where we have leadership that loves the brethren, that serves the brethren, and it does it pretty much without any payment at all. You know, we need to be so careful because Christ in Mark 7:7, he said very clearly that in vain, empty, nothingness, in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. I don't think we have that within the Church of God Miami. I don't think we have that in the Church of God in Auburndale. But you know, we have to be careful because if we become a city set on a hill, we will be attracting people who will come in and will bring in false doctrines. The churches today relegate God's commandments to the dustbin of history. They're done away with. You don't have to keep those commandments because they have been taught that the Old Testament is done away. You only have to be concerned with the New Testament. And brethren, what did Christ say when he was challenged by the Pharisees and the scribes? He said, you search the Scriptures. In them you think you have salvation. And these are they that speak of me, he said. And he used the Scriptures to show that he was who he said he was. God's laws were given to Israel to teach them how to live, to teach them how to receive great blessings. Here's the way it was supposed to work. And I'm sure you know these things, and I'm sure this is very basic, but maybe some of the children haven't heard this. God gave his laws to Israel so they could be blessed. Keep my laws, be blessed. And then what would happen? The nations round about would see it, and they would say, wow, we want what they have. Let's go worship their God. So it would go from God to Israel, to the nations, and then eventually to the world. The world would see that living God's way is the right way. It's the way to peace, to happiness, to strong family life, to all the things that make life worthwhile. Israel was supposed to be a city set on a hill. And they failed miserably, didn't they? Because physically, they never kept the laws. Spiritually, they never understood the laws. And the day is coming at the resurrection of the dead, when they will have an opportunity through God's Holy Spirit leading them and through the Church of God teaching them, they will learn the spiritual meaning of the laws that they rejected. You see, God doesn't give you the spiritual law. He gives the physical law. And when we keep the physical law, we then can see the spiritual reasoning for them. We can see the spiritual value to them. We learn spiritual from the physical. What does it take to be a city on the hill? Let's look at Deuteronomy 4 for a minute. Deuteronomy 4, you will probably recall that the book of Deuteronomy means second law. This is when Moses reiterated all of the laws that God had given him and put them into one book. And Israel was to have a very strong part in what was going on here. Because there they were a couple million people wandering in a desert. And here's God feeding them every day. Bread, water, quail. They were being fed miraculously. And do you think those people round about didn't notice that, didn't see that? Of course they did. Of course they did. Let's look at verse 6 of Deuteronomy 4, starting in verse 5. He says, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do so in the land, wherever you go to possess it. Keep therefore, and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations." The nations would see, and they would say, wow, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. Verse 7, "For what nation is there so great, and who has a God so near to them as the Lord eternal our God is in all the things that we call upon him for?" I'd like to read from Adam Clark's commentary about this particular verse, because it gives us an historical insight into what they were dealing with. He says, "There was no mode of worship at this time on the face of the earth that was not wicked, obscene, puerile, juvenile, childish, silly, foolish, or ridiculous. They were all that way, except that established by God himself among the Israelites. And every part of this, taking in its connection and reference, may be truly called a wise and reasonable service." Now, when you're young, and if every time you reached for something that wasn't good for you, a hand came out and went, "Stop, no." Pretty soon you'd stop reaching. And parents sometimes play games with their children, you know. They say, this child is curious. He wants to touch and smell and feel everything. And sometimes you have to let the child get a little burnt. Ooh. They learn real quickly that without being injured, they learn that, you know, there's some things that when mom and dad say no, they mean no, for my good. Right? Now, Adam Clark brings this out in his commentary. You see, God set up a very natural progression of the way things are supposed to work. From the Father to Jesus to the church to the nations and then to the world. God wanted then, and he wants now, to be near his people. He wants to be near each one of us here in the Church of God, Miami. And he wants to be near each one of us in the Church of God in Auburndale and in Largo and in all the different churches that are up and down the coast. There are probably 10 or 12 different churches of God, and most of them don't talk to one another. That's got to be a very, very sad event in God's eyes. God wants us to be his people, and yet we can't get along together, it seems. He said in verse 7, I'll read it again, "For what nation is there so great who has a God so near to them as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for?" God wanted to be near them and for them to be an example to the nations around about them. They were supposed to be a city set on a hill. In verse 9, he says, "Only take heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. But teach them to your sons and your sons' sons." And that has happened in some families, and it hasn't happened in others. But you know, there are some church leaders who have driven a wedge between parts of the body of Christ. They divide and they conquer. They don't very often try to unite. And you and I are blessed that we fellowship with a group, a corporate group, that does that. They want us to be in union, in unity, together. They want us to be a city on a hill. And you want to know something? I'd always, and this just came to me, that when you read that, being a city on the hill, we think of being a light to the world. Well, maybe our job is to be a light to the church by letting our light shine before the other churches of God, that they can see, that they can understand that it's not just about the money. It's about God's people. It's about serving them. It's about being united together to serve the great one and only true God. Now, Israel was blinded. They were spiritually blinded. In some sense, they were physically blinded. But you know, it seems that some of the corporate churches have become willingly ignorant of this blindness. You know, he said one place where blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Well, I don't know who's Jew and who's Gentile anymore. All right, I don't know who's a Gentile. I knew it was back then, but you know, today I guess I won't hurt if I get a little bit personal. The first time I came to Miami was in the spring of 1972. And I was in the school supply business. And they told me, hey, you got one company down there you're going to love dealing with. I said, what do you mean? It's a partnership, a Jew and a Cuban. I said, oh, I never met a Cuban. So it's going to be fun. So I went down and I got to know both of these gentlemen, and pretty soon they split. And they both continued to be my customers up until the day I left the business. But you know, when I first saw this Cuban gentleman, I said, he may speak Spanish, but he's an Israelite. I can tell by his heart. I can tell by the way he thinks, by the way he acts, the way he behaves. I was sitting in his office one afternoon, and right up here in Hialeah, not too far from where we are right now. And it was about 2 o'clock, and he says, Bill, he says, you in a hurry? I said, no. He said, would you mind going to the bank with me? I said, sure, I'll go to the bank with you. And he reaches into his bottom drawer, and he takes out a fistful of cash. He puts it down in front of me. He says, here, you count this, and when you get to 9,000, stop. And he took out and I said, why are you doing this? He said, you can't have $20,000 cash deposited any single time, or you have to fill out a form with IRS. I said, I knew this guy was an Israelite. All right? It was smart. But my point is that, and I don't know what the point was, except that our brothers and sisters of different races, different creeds, can be together in unison to be a city on the hill, to be a light to the world, and maybe to be a light to the churches of God. Let's look at Romans 11. Romans 11, the Apostle Paul dealt with two different types of churches. He dealt with the Jews, and they tried to kill him, so he left town. Then he became the apostle to the Gentiles. And what a marvelous, marvelous work he did. Because without the Apostle Paul, and without his teachings, and without his letters that he wrote, you'd have a large section of the Bible that we'd have to just throw out. It wouldn't be here if he hadn't written these letters. In Romans 11, here was Paul writing to the church of God in Rome. And some people get angry with me when I say that. But it was God's church. These were people who were members of the church of God by virtue of the fact that they were in Jerusalem on Pentecost. Some were Jews, some were Gentiles. You can read about it in Acts 3. We're not going to go there. But they saw the Holy Spirit descend on the apostles. And they heard through the great tongues that were given to them that one language spoken and 10 languages were heard. Incredible, not to build up the apostles, but to reach the people with the message. These are the people in Rome that the Apostle Paul was writing to. And when this letter to Romans was written, he was believed to be in Corinth. And it's funny, when he gets to Rome, he then writes a book to the Corinthians, and you compare the two, and you see how they lock together very, very beautifully. But in Romans 11, he's writing to a group of Christians that had never had a minister. They had never been established as a church. All they had was the Jewish synagogue and the scriptures of the Old Testament. New Testament hadn't been written yet. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were just not there. And then when he started writing these letters, they became the scriptures that put them together, that made sense of a lot of the Jewish traditions. In Romans 11, let's look at verse 25. He says, "For I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of the mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. That blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." And he goes through in one place, I don't know if this is the place necessarily, where he talks about the Gentiles are grafted into the olive tree of Israel so that they become one as part of the Israel of God, as you can read about back in Galatians. There's such a fantastic future, and all we have to do is to become a city on a hill. That we are a city on the hill that gives light to the world. Matthew 12. In Matthew 12, Jesus talks about an example of what happens when your light reaches out to other people. Matthew 12:42. He says, the queen of the south shall rise up in judgment with this generation and shall condemn it. And you'll recall back in Solomon's time how the queen of Sheba came from Egypt to Jerusalem to learn of God. And she was incredibly impressed. He goes on to say, she shall rise, the queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it. For she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, a greater than Solomon is here. And you can look in 1 Kings 10, verses 4 and 5. And it talks about when the queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon and how impressed she was. And she wrote the meat at his table, and the sitting of his servants. His leading men would come in and have dinner with him. You tried doing that today, and you probably wouldn't last too long. But they loved Solomon. They respected him. They saw that God was with him. And then Solomon, well, he went the way of all flesh. But you know, when this woman saw the things that he had and the way he treated his people and the beautiful relationship that they had, she says, it says, and his ascent by which he went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. She was broken in the sense that the things that he could do, she couldn't do as the queen. She could go up to the house of God, and she had to have an armament with her. What a terrible way to have to live, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be terrible to have bodyguards with you everywhere you went? And she saw Solomon, and his people loved him, and they respected him, and they had great wealth, great food. And she says she went back, she was broken. No spirit in her. Now, when we look at what we have in this country today, brethren, Solomon was supposed to be a light to the world. And the way he went after strange gods, and the way he went after false idols, and the way he went away from the true God, his light became darkness. Fast forward to the 21st century. We are supposed to be the light to the world. And when Paul wrote these things to the church at Rome, he wanted them to understand, look, as a light, you have an obligation. And you have lived up to that obligation. He says in Romans 1, in verse 8, he says, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, that your faith is spoken of throughout the world. And of course, he was talking about the known world. He was talking about the world that they knew about, certainly not as far as we know in this nation. But Matthew Henry's commentary makes some interesting comments about this. It says, throughout the whole world. It says that is the Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire at that time ran from India up to close to Britain. And it was 100 years later it took over Britain. They didn't even know that Britain was out there. We were watching a National Geographic show the other night, and they thought that that world was what they could see. It was the Egypt, Africa, Asia, and Europe. That was the whole world. And then they found out there was another world out in the English Channel. And it was a surprise. And of course, being the loving, kind person that he was, Caesar said, I got to have that. And then they went to war with them for 100 years. So when he says that they were being spoken about throughout the whole world, he's talking about the whole known world at the time. And he said, into which the Roman Christians, upon Claudius' edict to banish all Jews from Rome, they were scattered. Now, why would the Christians be scattered when the Jews were driven out? Well, the reason was that they were meeting together. There was no separation. The Christians were attempting to teach the Jews that Jesus the Messiah had come. And the Jews were saying, no, he's still coming. And eventually they got to the point where they had to separate. They couldn't stay together because they were too far apart. But you see, they were now back in Rome. And their mercy and their love and their kindness was spoken out through the entire nation. He says they left a very good report behind them wherever they had been in all the churches. And there was this good effect of their sufferings. If they had not been persecuted, if they had not been famous, they would never have been heard of. But they were persecuted, and the persecution is what made them famous. You see, this was indeed a good name, a name of good things with God and good people. As the elders of old, so these Romans obtained a good report through faith. And you can read in Hebrews 11 about the faith of God's people going all the way back to Enoch. Didn't take a lot. It took just enough to get the word onto these pages so that you and I would have something to look to. You see, they were a city set on a hill. Just one or two men, one or two women of honor who served God. They were a city on a hill. John 17 puts a challenge to the church. John 17. This was Jesus' last prayer the night before he was crucified. In John 17, he's praying to his Father, verses 1 down through 22. And in verse 23, he says, I in them, and you in me, that they may be made perfect in one. He was praying for a perfection and a unity in his church that could only come from the blessings of God. The world may know that you have sent me, and you have loved them as you have loved me. What an incredible, incredible thing to say. You know, in Hebrews 11, it talks about by faith Abraham, when he was called to go into a place where he should, after receive an inheritance, that he obeyed. He went out. You know, he didn't. I don't imagine he really wanted to go, but he packed up his family and all their possessions, and off they went. He obeyed, and he went out, not knowing where he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Are we going to live in a city on a hill? Are we going to be a city on the hill? This is what it takes. It's going to take God to be the builder and the maker. Now, a final few scriptures I'd like to mention to show us how we can become a city on the hill. And I'm not preaching at you, I'm preaching to me too. Your brethren, I know that we, in whatever congregation we happen to be with, we have a responsibility. And in Ephesians 2, the Apostle Paul writes some things that are truly inspirational, educational, an incredibly astute man, that he could look at the scriptures in the Old Testament, and he studied at the knee of Gamaliel. I mean, he was educated in the Old Testament, and it enabled him to see the things that Jesus of Nazareth did and fit them together, to see him as the Passover, to see him as our atonement. And when he talks about the Feast of Tabernacles, he knows and refers to Jesus Christ. He doesn't refer to Jesus specifically, but he refers to the fact that his church will be ensconced in the Feast of Tabernacles. Ephesians 2, verse 20, talks about a city that's been built. He says, and you are built upon the foundation of the apostles, the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. Without Christ as the cornerstone of that church, of that foundation, we can never build. We can never build, unless we want to do it the way the Roman church did it. Go out and start killing people. And I don't think that's what we want to do. We don't want to kill people. We want to help people learn how to live. He says, in whom all the building, fitly framed together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are builded together for the habitation of God through his Spirit. Are we going to be a city on the hill? How do you become a city on the hill? God in us, through the power of his Spirit, has a work to do. 1 Corinthians 3. And it's believed that this 1 Corinthians was written from Rome. Sometimes there's internal indications, sometimes not. But in 1 Corinthians 3, starting in verse 9, he shows that, brethren, you and I have a work together. You here, me in Auburndale, wherever God's people are scattered, we have a work together. For we are laborers together, not with us, but with God. God is the one that's doing the building. God is the one that does the strengthening. God is the one that unifies. God is the one that leads. And we're just working together with him. Boy, I don't know about you, but that gives me goosebumps. God's working with me and working with you that we can be together in one. He said, we are laborers together with God. You are God's husbandry. You are God's building, according to the grace of God which is given unto me. As a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another build thereon. But let every man take heed, lest he builds in vain. What do we have to do in order? What do we have to do in order to become a city on a hill? Well, it's easy and it's hard. It's easy and it's difficult. How can the Church of God, Auburndale Church of God, become a city on a hill? How could the Church of God Miami become a city on a hill? Well, the first thing we have to do is ask for God to open doors for us. You know, we're all doing little things. Have him open doors for us. Maybe it's through your radio, internet, booklets, public opportunities. Ian Boyne down in the Caribbean has done an incredible job in building a church that well, obviously he's acting as a tool of God to bring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people into a feast, into a weekly Sabbath service, because he's telling them things that they never learned before, things they didn't know in church. There's a funny story, and I will digress for a minute if you don't mind. There was, before the Church of God of this current era started, there was Church of God Seventh Day, and they still exist. They're still they're in Denver, Colorado, I believe, is their headquarters. And they had a couple of evangelists that they sent out to different cities, different towns, with tent meetings, revival meetings. They didn't have TV, didn't have internet, didn't have any of those things. And they would go in and have a tent meeting, and the people were upset with the things that they were being taught. And they accused these two men, their name is Duggar and Dodd. They accused them of preaching from a different Bible than they were preaching from. You got a different Bible than we've got. Our Bible doesn't say any of the things that you're saying. And there was a reason why they were confused. But what they did, they went out and they hired a notary public to sit down with their Bible and the people's Bible. And he compared them and came back with a report about 3 days later. Said, no, they're exactly the same Bible. And they couldn't figure out why they had never heard the things that were being taught to them at those meetings. And when you understand the liturgical calendar that the Roman Church introduced, and that most of the churches follow, there are scriptures that they never have read to them. And they're here if you are ever in a position to discuss this with some of them. It's going to go right over their head because they've never had a foundation to understand the truth of God. You know, you and I are blessed because we have an opportunity in our daily lives, if maybe not to be a city on a hill, at least to be a light on a candlestick. And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to do when people are anti-God, when they're so immersed in this world, they've been so deceived that they don't know how to they don't know how to live anymore. Well, I don't want to go back 50 years and tell you how nice Miami used to be, but I could. You see, Christ knew that he had work to do. And he knew he didn't have a lot of time to do it. He knew that Passover was coming up, was going to reach the fulfillment of the plan that he and the Father had. But you see, the light that burns in us must be the light of Jesus Christ. He is the light of life, and he is the light that leads to life. John 9, verses 4 and 5. He says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it's the day. The night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. That's what he said. And he's been proven correct. When Jesus then spoke Jesus again in verse 12 of John 8, he said, I am the light of the world. He that follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. The churches of this world are leading God's people into darkness. They're not teaching them the truth about the kingdom of God, about what God has planned for mankind. Live your life, go to confession, die, go to heaven. That's pretty much the process. But brethren, you and I know better. You and I know that we have a job to do. And we work together in unity, and that's great. We do it at the feast. We do it whenever we get a chance to come down or whenever you get a chance to come up to Auburndale. It's a long ride. 75 is not too bad. Doing 75, it's not too bad when you're driving on some of the used to have to come down Route 27 when I first started coming down. And that was not a very, very good ride. But today we've got things that enable us to do works that we've never done before. CGI is using as you probably have heard, they've done away with their TV broadcast, and they're using the internet exclusively. And they're reaching a lot of people. They're getting many, many people. And I'm not saying you should follow their internet lead. I don't know what's best for the Church of God Miami. But I do know how you can find out what's best for the Church of God Miami. Ask God to open some doors for you. Ask God to give you favor where He wants you to be. And if you do, what's the scripture that says, if a son asks his father for a piece of bread, is he going to give him a serpent? No. When our children ask for something, if it's good for them, we give it to them. We try to. Let's use our opportunities as they come. Have God open some doors for us. And who knows where those doors are going to lead. Maybe the next time I come down, you'll be meeting in the Joe Robbie Field. Is that still here? I understand that was the big ball field that they built right about the time I stopped coming to Miami. I don't think they use it anymore. But look, there's no limit to what God can do through one servant who humbles himself before God. And that servant's here. That servant is the Church of God Miami. And I'm just so happy and pleased that we can be together in peace and love and joy and just have a good time and learn together and grow together. And I thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. And I hope it doesn't take me 20 more years to get back to Miami. Yeah, I could make it.